We're going to talk about New World plants that hit the big time. It's an amazing story of how Native Americans domesticated corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, and chocolate. To me, it's a fascinating history of breeding native wild plants into crop plants and their worldwide economic importance today. What I'm going to focus on primarily is kind of what we know. I mean, I don't have all the answers. I don't know how many billions of tons of corn are produced around the world, and I don't have that data for you, but we're going to talk more about the beginnings and the end. But what I do need to tell you is that all of these plants today are some of the most important plants for any civilization on the planet, and especially chocolate, because it just keeps getting better and better. All right, so welcome, my welcome. Whoops, let me go back here. So today we have some goals. We're going to talk about where crop plants come from. We'll get to know the native plant families that these veggies come from, kind of how they were domesticated, because a lot of that's still a great big secret, and how these plants helped build civilizations. And then throughout the talk, I'm going to be telling you about how we know all of this, because the better science gets, the more we know. And it's just incredible between the time I started my career 30 years ago and now. It is just amazing how much we know and how well we know about the origins of agriculture, not only in the New World, North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, but around the whole planet. So let's just keep moving here. All right, so first of all, I wanted to say something. Bethany, am I on, is my picture up? Yes?
Yes, it is. Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, okay, well, we can go ahead and turn it off. Get rid of me and we'll just look at the presentation.
Okay. Can you actually stop your video on your bottom left-hand side of your screen?
Let me see. Yeah. Well, given the issues we had, here we are. Stop video. Perfect.
There you.
Okay. All right. So now I can move around a little bit more. So anyway, this week we celebrated Veterans Day 2020, and I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of our veterans listening here today and dedicate this lecture to you. And thank you for your service and sacrifice. My dad was a Marine in World War II and served in the Pacific and drove a landing craft. He was born in 1925, joined up at 17, and was 20 years old when the war ended. So I just wanted to give you all a little perspective. And then, of course, Victory Gardens were a very big deal. And as master gardeners, I'm sure you can kind of appreciate what everybody was doing back then for the war effort. So I just wanted to give that shout out to all our vets and to thank you very, very much. Okay, so here's a popular pastime for some of us. We check out the veggies in the grocery store, right? And we ask, what is this? What plant part is this? Where's it from? And why does it take me so long to get through the veggie section? So if you're one of those people, you come to the right place for this little lecture today. And thank you for being here. So here's some secrets of plant domestication that hold true for all the plants we're talking about today. Their biology, they come from native plant wild relatives. They tend to have a lot of what we call genetic plasticity. That is, you can breed all different kinds of colors and sizes and shapes from the same parents. They're mostly annuals, but not all. And that's important because if they're annuals, they grow every year and you can plant them and you can see them. You can select for the qualities you want very, very quickly, rather than having to grow like a palm tree that lives for 30, 40 years and start all over again with the new fruit. So most of our crop plants are annuals because they're very, very easy to not only reproduce, but to select for a character you want. Like say you want a bigger seed on a sunflower, you can do that within a couple years. You don't have to wait, 30, 40 years to do that. They love disturbance and they are weedy. So when you think about growing crops, where you disturb the land every year when we plant a crop. Well, that's exactly what domesticated plants love. They can reproduce more than once a year. For example, corn, if you live in a place where there's no winter or freezing, you can grow more than one crop a year. And that's very important when you're thinking about production and feeding people. And the other thing about them is that they can grow in many different places. So a lot of these crop plants like beans and corn and squash, they can grow from sea level to 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 feet above sea level. And that's what made them really useful to people, because where do people live? They live all over the place too. So people are highly adaptable, and so are these crop plants. So socially and culturally, here's some interesting things. They're selected and bred by people according to human needs. And that's called artificial selection. So what's driving the evolution of these plants isn't Mother Nature, it's us. And so we have figured out a way throughout time, it seems, since the beginning of agriculture, to select exactly what we want and to breed it. The other thing about them is that a lot of these crop plants are spread by people. People carry them around, everywhere. So they go from Europe to the Americas, or they go from the Americas to Europe early on. But it was people who brought these crop plants out of where they began and spread them around for everyone to grow. And it's a win-win for plants and people. So imagine if you're a crop plant and you have to go back into the wild, you're not going to be very successful, because you're not going to get the tending or the water or the care or the insect, removal that happens on plants that grow as crops. And so crop plants need us just as much as we need them. So it's a win-win for both of us. Okay. So just about every plant part we eat today has been modified by humans to increase its nutritional value in some way. And of course, some of us go overboard, like this lovely pumpkin grower. But I put this picture in here to illustrate the fact that, crop plants are very plastic. I mean, the wild relative of this pumpkin is probably less than the size of my palm or even smaller. Yet we have figured out ways to grow these plants to get what we want and need. So it's pretty amazing. It's an incredible story. So I have a question for you. What group of plants supplies most of the world's food? Would it be the pea family, which are called the legumes? Is it the grass family, or perhaps the sunflower family? What do y'all think? Okay, let's see if we can find the answer. Okay, the answer is grasses. And here's a quote from a very, very famous botanist. It's Peter Raven, who's written many, many wonderful botany textbooks. And he says, just over 100 kinds of plants now provide over 90% of the calories we consume, either directly or indirectly. And just 3 kinds of plants, all in the grass family, namely corn, wheat, and rice, provide about 60% of our calories. So that's something to think about, that how so few plants, I mean, there's like 250,000 different species of plants on Earth. And we're only using about 100 kinds of those. That's pretty impressive. So the cereal family is the family that feeds most of us, and they grow worldwide. There's grasses and wheat and corn and oats and barley and millet, but they all have the same family characteristics, and that's why we group plants into families. So the cereal family, all of the plants have one ovary, which turns into be one seed or one grain. All the flower parts are in threes. And the fruit is a very special kind of fruit, which we call a caryopsis. So imagine a corn kernel. It's just one little fruit, and the seed coat is actually fused to the actual inside of the seed, and it's hard. And that helps it, of course, survive and be stored and be planted one by one. And that's another characteristic of cultivated plants. So let's move on here and talk about some other things. So if you think about corn, beans, squash, and chili peppers and chocolate, which we're talking about today, they all have similar origins and histories of use among the prehistoric cultures of the Americas. They have specific centers of domestication and spread to the rest of the Americas first, then the rest of the world. And today I'm going to focus on answering some of these questions using corn as an example, because corn, also known as maize, is probably the best known of all the cultivated New World plants. So much work has been done to discover its history, its spread, its origin, its domestication, that I'm going to use this as our example. But the same thing happened, and pretty much at very similar times, to squash and beans and chili peppers, because they all originated in Central America and Southern Mexico, and were cultivated by early Native American peoples. So when I talk about corn, I'm also talking about the others as well. So let's start with corn, because its history is the best documented to date. Here's a map, and it shows origins of corn, beans, and squash. And what you can see here at the top is a map with 3 different colors that represent corn in yellow, squash in orange, and beans in red. And you can see they all, we think, science tells us that they all originated in very close contact with each other. And if you look at the little table below, you'll see what dates we know that we've found from the archaeological record, where the first pieces of these cultivated plants turn up. So squash is the oldest, as it turns out. It was found in caves in Oaxaca, and they've dated them, radiocarbon dated the squash seeds to about 10,000 years ago. Corn is next. We know its age is about 6,300 years old, and then beans are younger. They're coming in at about 2,100 years ago. But this is all before the time of Christ. And that's an important thing to think about and to note for a second, because when we look further down the road at the history of the New World, we see that corn, beans, and squash really were the foundations of all these magnificent civilizations that flourished here before the conquest. So let's take our first look at corn. Like I was saying earlier, the corn plant is unique among most cultivated plants because it really can't survive without people. Corn seeds have to be taken off the husk when they're ripe and planted. If you leave a corn cob to just lay in the field with the kernels on it, the kernels will just stay on it, and maybe one or two will germinate, but all the other kernels won't. So corn was domesticated by people, and in doing this, it became very dependent on humans. So each kernel is a separate ovary, and that was what I was telling you about. It's the caryopsis. Each of those is a single fruit. So when you buy a corn cob in the store, inside, after you shuck it, are individual fruits from individual, what we call ovaries, the female part. Now, how do they get the fruit? Well, look at the tassels on the corn, and each of those is actually a receptive pistil that goes all the way down into each and every one of those kernels. So one pollen grain has to find one of those silks and pollinate one of those kernels. So imagine how much pollen has to land on those silks at the top and be viable and work its way down to fertilize what we call the ovary and to produce one kernel. And that's pretty darn amazing. But that's the way corn works. So let's look at the corn fruit for a second. If you look at the upper left-hand part of the picture, you see a corn kernel germinating. And so that's one fruit, one teeny tiny fruit that when it starts to germinate, first puts out a little root, and then it puts out a little leaf, and that becomes the corn plant. So inside each kernel is the most important part, which is starch. Starch is produced by the corn plant as food for the little embryo, which in this picture over on the right, it's called the germ. The germ is the baby plant, and the starch that's in there is put there by the plant so that when the embryo or the baby plant germinates, it can have some food. And that's what humans discovered as being very rich in sugar. So that's the sugar part, the starch part of the corn. And that is why corn became such an important food crop. And that's why corn was domesticated, because we could manipulate the fruit itself and make the kernels bigger. And that was the foundation of all corn agriculture around the world, that very little kernel and people's ability to figure that out. So if you look at the top of that illustration, it says soft endosperm and then there's hard endosperm. Well, the soft endosperm is where the starch is. And that's what we eat today. That's what we eat when we eat corn. We're eating starch in that little kernel. Over on the lower left-hand corner, I have a little picture of popcorn because from what we can tell, the earliest corn that was used was actually a pod corn that looked a lot like popcorn. And it's not hard to imagine people even 8,000 years ago popping corn because it was so easy to do and then eating their corn that way. So here's your question. This is a quiz. Why does Indian corn have so many different colors? I told you the answer a minute ago, but I just wanted to see how much attention you all are paying. No, not really. Well, the answer is because each kernel is a separate fruit with a separate pollen dad. So when you look back at a corn cob with all these different colored corn kernels, think about each different color coming from a different parent, a different male corn. So sometimes the kernels are red and the pollen has DNA for, red corn kernels, and sometimes it has DNA for blue corn kernels, and sometimes it has it for white. And whatever mixes with the female part, the ovary of the plant, will produce these different colors. So, okay, so let's look at how we know, where these plants come from and why they're so important and what their record is. And we can look at what the modern record tells us. Okay, so let's look at what we know. When we look at corn today, we see all these different varieties. And like I was saying earlier, we're able to sort of figure out how this domesticated plant works with us. And so we have figured out that it's an annual. It grows from seed every year. It's easily modified. We can change it around if we want by breeding. It can be grown in temperate zones and in any altitude in the tropics and the subtropics. And really importantly, it can be stored. And that is really one of the major builders of civilization, when you can store your crop from season to season to ward off starvation and bad years. Where else do we find this information? Well, there's a tremendous amount of information online. There's the Native American Ethnobotany database. You can go anywhere on the internet and you can find all kinds of information, but this is just an example of one of them. And you can go back through to these databases and look through the records of people, academics and students who came along earlier, like say 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago, and actually went out to the Native American pueblos all over the New World and recorded the uses of these plants, not just corn, but all the plants that people were using that were native plants. And so you can go to these records if you want to study more about them and look at them and inform yourself about how people use plants. The other thing we can do is we can look at all the different varieties that are around the planet. And here's some corn found in Peru, just 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And it just shows you all the different varieties of corn that people are using even today. And this is native corn. This is from native peoples, from the Quechua. And they're still growing crops that their ancestors grew, but you have to remember that this corn in Peru came all the way, it was domesticated first in Mexico and then spread to South America, where it was then once again domesticated into all these different kinds of varieties. So how do we know about this, and what does the historical record tell us? So that's another piece of study that we can look at to see what corn did and how important these crop foods were to earlier peoples. So when Hernan Cortez invaded Mexico in 1519, he captured the metropolis, the city of Tenochtitlan in Mexico, which is where modern Mexico City is today. And what they found was a superpower that was built on corn agriculture. This was an empire with architecture, writing, commerce, a military, a war industry, a hierarchy of power, a supreme ruler. They enslaved other peoples. They had a very sophisticated religion. They had lots of agricultural production and more. And this is a painting done by Diego Rivera, famous Mexican artist, about what that might have looked like back in the day at contact in 1519. A lot of ancient American civilizations were built on corn agriculture. In Mexico, the Olmec and the Mayan and the Aztec. In South America, the Incas. In North America, the Anasazi and the Mogollon and the Hohokam, and many, many other civilizations of the Americas. So back to the record, when the Spaniards came and conquered Mexico, they began to document everything they saw. And by the late 1500s, there was a priest named Father Sahagún who had native Aztec people who were enslaved begin to document and write down their culture, aspects of their culture, so they could send these books back to Spain. And that's exactly what this is. This is a picture from a book that was produced, a codex, they call them codices, in the late 1500s and sent back to Spain. And it shows Native Americans, Aztec peoples using corn. And the picture, I think, to me depicts really kind of the reverence people have for corn. But already, way back then, we knew that corn was a major source and, a driver of the economies of Latin America. This is one of the first images of corn to be sent to Europe. This is from the Codex. So as I was saying, Aztecs who had been enslaved were put to work writing all this down. And this is one of the first botanical depictions of corn ever drawn. I just wanted to show you all that. And it's in the Florentine Codex. So how else do we know? Well, we know what the archaeological record tells us, and this is a big, this is a fun part of it as well. And what we do with archaeology is we, of course, dig up the past, and then we try to rebuild the past or reconstruct the past based on what we're finding. So, we can reconstruct past lifeways through archaeology. And this is an image, it's a hypothetical drawing of a Hohokam settlement near Phoenix, supposedly around 700 AD. But nobody was around to draw this or write it down. So we have to go back to the archaeological record and really use it as a mirror or a lens to look back into the past. And one ways we do that is, of course, we look at the big archaeological sites. This is Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. And it's been dated to about 600 to 1200 AD. And the foundation of this community was corn. There was corn being grown all over the Southwest. We know the weather was probably a little wetter, so corn agriculture was a little easier to do. But we also know that by this time, people were building, they were doing a lot of irrigation And if you go to Phoenix, you'll see that there are extensive canals that were built and dated that were built there to grow corn and other crops. This is one of the Hohokam irrigation systems. This one was mapped, way back in the olden days. I can't remember when, but it was like the 1930s that an archaeologist mapped these ditches, which are the lines that you see on the map, all running into the Salado River. Over in the corner here on the left is an excavated irrigation canal. So you can kind of see the magnitude with which people were irrigating and trying to bring water to these crops. It was very, very complex and necessary. Another way we get at the record is we look at the actual archaeological record, what archaeologists dig up. And these are old, they're not fossilized, it's actually just dried corn pieces that are about 6,000 years old that the archaeologists dug up in a dry cave in Mexico. And they're able to look at the corn cob and to see what the position of the corn kernels was. And what it shows us in this picture is that this isn't corn yet. This is teosinte, the wild relative of corn, evolving into corn as we know it today. So what the arrows are showing is that where the corn kernels sat, where these areas were now open like we see on a modern cob today, and they weren't closed anymore by bracts that held them in. So that's how we know that this, was one of the steps along the way to domestication. So it was, we call it open kernels. And if you look at the evolution of the corn cob, this is the record of domestication of corn. Over on the left here, in the red picture on the very far left is teosinte. That is the wild relative of corn, and it is still around today, okay? And then if you look at the middle one, that is a hybrid corn being, it was actually bred, in the lab, but using different practices that you can breed back. So they bred this one back, and then of course we have the modern corn on the right there. And then when you look at the traditional varieties of maize, it kind of lets you imagine what earlier corn looked like, and right smack dab in the middle there is some of the earliest looking corn, and it was a pod corn or a popcorn, and so that's what they look like. So how do you make a transformation like that? How do you breed corn from a grass that looks like that on the left into a giant cob? Well, there was a lot of manipulation that had to go on. If you look at this picture, on the left is teosinte and on the right is modern corn. And yeah, they do look similar, but take a look at the number of branches there are on the teosinte. And look at where the cobs are on the teosinte. They're on the branches. And if you go over to the right and look at modern corn, what do you see? You don't see any branches. You see a stem. You see a stem in one single stem, and in the axils of the leaves, or in the middle, near the stem where the leaves come out, you see a corn cob. And then at the top of the corn plant in modern corn, you see a tassel. But look, you only see one. If you go back to teosinte, you see the branches with the corn cobs on them, and you see tassels on every one of the branches. So what people did in the process of domestication of corn is they made a much more compact plant. And then they also changed the whole system from the plants being able to be pollinated by multiple tassels, that's where the pollen is, to one. And it took a long time to figure this one out. This issue was, how is corn domesticated? It just involved 30, 40, 50 years of people speculating, trying to figure it out, until we found in the archaeological record the actual examples, and also botanists had worked on how this change might happen. And so with a lot of study and a lot of science and a lot of experimentation, they finally figured this one out. So let's take a look at beans real quickly. I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about beans because the record isn't as amazing, but remember that beans and squash and corn followed the same patterns of domestication. So the beans that we know and love to eat are mostly in this subfamily of bean plants called the Papilionoideae. And the picture I'm showing you here is a picture of the good old pea, but it's a huge family of plants. And once again, families of plants are identified by the characteristics that they all share. And one of the things that peas have is this thing called a legume, and that's the pod. So here's a question, true or false? The pea fruit is always a legume. What's a legume? It's that pod. So you have a linear pod. It usually opens up on both sides, and inside are the peas. And the answer is true. So if you see a pea pod on a plant, chances are it's most likely a pea plant. Now, some other plants have pods as well, but all peas have pea pods. So even though beans were domesticated in the New World, they were also domesticated in other parts around the world. So for every continent on the planet, you have different systems of domestication that actually domesticated and brought all these beans, into our world of food. So I made a list here that just kind of shows you where all the beans in the world sort of come from. When you go to the grocery store and you buy black beans, where do they come from? Let's see. Oh, I didn't write that down, but they came from Mexico. Pinto beans, they came from Mexico. But then if you go to, chickpeas, garbanzos, and buy those, well, they're from the Near East. So the point here is that every culture around the world domesticated beans, but in the New World, we have a record of domestication, and we find that they were domesticated twice. So around 4,400 years ago, beans were domesticated in South America, and then a whole different group were independently domesticated in Central America, in Central America and Mexico and American Southwest. And today there are hundreds and hundreds of varieties, and it's a fascinating group to study because there is so much variation. But when you look in the archaeological record, in almost all the sites that you look at that have pueblos or dwellings, you will find remains of beans and bean cultivation. Now we're going to take a look at squash. So if you look at the squash family, that's actually the oldest group of domesticated plants in the New World. But once again, I need to tell you that squashes, the pumpkin family, is a worldwide family. And for every continent we have, there was also independent domestication of different kinds of squash. But we'll talk a little bit about that and sort of how to sort them out. And we'll learn about where certain ones from the New World came from. So in this picture, you can see what the characteristics of the squash family. And a couple things I just wanted to point out. It's worldwide, mostly tropical in distribution. 700 species are known, and I'm sure there are many, many more. One thing about squashes is that the plants, the flowers are male or female. And the female flower is what produces the squash, but it needs, of course, the male flower to get pollinated. So if you're growing squashes, you will find that you have male flowers, or pumpkins, for example, you'll find you have male flowers on the plant, but then a different kind of flower, which is the female flower, but they grow together. Squashes have what we call an inferior ovary. So that big pumpkin that you see over there on the right is actually an ovary where the flower parts come out at the top. And you can also see that on squashes when you go to the grocery store. You can see the remains of the flowers and the stem at the top of the fruit. Okay, so here's the question for you. Is this true or false? Squash and pumpkins are both native to the New World. What do y'all think? Well, that answer's true. Okay, but as I was saying, there are other squashes and pumpkins that are native to other parts of the New World. Okay, so here's a native one, Cucurbita pepo. That is our beloved pumpkin. It has a soft rind. It's what we call the field pumpkin. Also the zucchini. They were all domesticated in central and southern Mexico starting around 10,000 years ago. Why did people domesticate squashes? Well, take a look at those seeds. And if you've ever eaten a pumpkin seed, you know they're full of protein and they're full of fat. So we think that the reason people domesticated squashes, pumpkins, zucchinis, etc., wasn't so much for the fleshy part, the pumpkin part. It was actually for the seeds. Another thing about squashes is that, once again, like the little corn kernel, there are some that can be stored. So this is the winter squash, Cucurbita maxima, grown all over the native, like the Western U.S. By native people. It has a hard rind, and it's grown for seed and pulp, but it's very storable. And so between the corn and the beans, which are also storable, and squash, including the seeds, these were the three most important plants that we know of in early Native American culture. But having a hard rind and being storable for months on end is a really important characteristic of domesticated plants. So here's the winter squash. And when archaeologists and ethnobotanists went out to start looking at how people use plants, they found that some of the squashes were actually considered quite sacred and are revered by native peoples today. And if you look up here in the upper right-hand corner, you see a beautiful Zuni squash blossom necklace, which is still being made today. And it depicts squash blossoms around on the chain there. If you look at the picture of the young ladies, they're wearing these squash blossom necklaces. The Great Seal of the Zuni tribe, look right in the middle there. It's got a squash blossom necklace. So this gives you some idea of just how important squashes are to native peoples. It's not just the Zuni tribe. Most Southwestern tribes really value their squashes, their old ones, their traditional crops, and new ones that come along. If you go to Africa, you'll see that squashes also are valued. And here's some other members of the squash family. You've got the gourd there on the stamp, and then, believe it or not, watermelons are part of that family, and chayote is over on the left. Cantaloupe is part of that family, and loofahs too are part of it. So let's take a look at the potato family, because it's actually the chili family, or it's the chili, tomato, and potato family, among others. So this is another family that's worldwide, but certain members of that family, certain species, were selected for whatever character they had, which in this case was heat and flavor, and domesticated. And when the Spaniards came to the New World, they found all these amazing hot chilies, and they were very quickly taken back to the Old World, to Europe, and grown there as well. But the chilies are in the potato family, which is called the Solanaceae, and they have certain characteristics as well that unite them as a family. So capsaicin is the major ingredient in chilies, and it's hot. We think it was domesticated in Mexico about 7,000 years ago. And if you look over on the right, you'll see one of the characteristics that unites all the potato family, which includes the chilies and the bell peppers and eggplant and a bunch of others. If you look in the middle of that flower, you see this blue thing, and that blue thing is actually it's a tube, and it's a tube of stamens, male parts with the pollen in them, that surround what we call the pistil or the ovary, the female part of the flower. And so these stamens are wrapped around that pistil or female part of the flower, that little tube there, the white one, and that is what one of the characteristics of the family is all chilies, all members of the family have this to some extent. Also look at the petals. There's actually 5 of them, and they're all separate from each other, and they kind of push back or recurve back when the flower is open. So here's another look at them. So the potato family, if you look at potatoes, once again, the annual crop, domesticated, but the flowers of potatoes are very, very similar to the flowers of chilies and tomatoes and everything else in that family. The fruit is usually also a berry. So if you think of, hang on a sec. If you think of things like tomatoes, those are a berry, and they hang down like that and grow very similarly to each other. Okay, so let's have another question. The hottest pepper on earth is which? The Anaheim from New Mexico, one of our favorites. The habanero from the Caribbean, which is really, really hot. Excuse me, or the ghost pepper from India. Let's take a guess. Okay, it's the ghost pepper from India. And if you look over here at this scale, this is the Scoville heat scale. And this was a scale invented by an interested person from England, Dr. Scoville, in the last century. And the way it works is it is based on, if you look over here on the left hand, you'll see these big, big numbers like 15 million at the top to 16 million. That's what pure capsaicin, or the hot part of a pepper, that's how many Scoville units it has. If you look at the bottom of the scale, you'll look at bell peppers, which say 0. I mean, it's small text, and I'm sorry about that, small print, but it says 0 Scoville units. If you look at in the middle at the habanero, it says it has what? 580,000 Scoville units, and the ghost pepper has over 1 million. So how is that scale derived? Well, actually what it was a piece of the pepper was ground up, and a certain amount, like just a teeny little bit, was put into a bowl, and then water was added, and the number of drops of water added to make it not taste hot once you mixed it up, was the unit. So for habanero peppers, for a given amount of habanero, like just a teeny tiny, like not even a quarter of a teaspoon, it would take 580,000 drops of water to make it not hot. So that's how the scale was developed. And believe it or not, it's still used today. So that's an interesting fact. But sometimes you'll buy a bottle of hot sauce in the grocery store, and it'll actually give you the Scoville heat scale rating. Okay, so the rest of this family that I've alluded to, well, in the chili, pepper, tomato, and let's see what else is chili, peppers, tomatoes, and eggplant family, green pepper, you have tomatoes. Once again, look at the yellow anthers that form a tube right there in the middle of the flower. Tomatoes were actually domesticated along the west coast of South America, as far as we know. And then, of course, there are other plants in the family. There's nightshade, which grows all over Texas. Eggplant, that was a plant that was domesticated in China. We have drug plants from that family. Datura, which is a New World plant. It's very poisonous, but it's a beautiful garden plant. And then, of course, good old tobacco. That's also in this amazing family. So let's go to cocoa. Let's go to chocolate. This is one of the few plants that is not an annual. It's actually a perennial, and it's actually a tree. And we don't know as much about the domestication of chocolate as we would like to, but we do know from the records that we've been talking about, the history and the archaeology and what we see today, make observations about it, that it's been around for a very long time, and it has been a domesticated plant in the New World since at least oh gosh, at least 500 AD. So um, it's just a fascinating plant in the sense that there's really nothing else like it in the New World or anywhere else when you think about chocolate. Uh, and if you look at the illustration here that I'm showing you, you'll see that it's this giant fruit. It's really a big fruit from the tropics. It grows on trees, literally. It doesn't grow on branches of trees. It grows right straight out of the trunk. And then there's this big pod that hangs down, and inside the pod are the seeds. So that's called cauliflory. When a fruit just hangs right off the trunk of something, it's called a cauliflorous fruit. Okay, so here's a question. Where does chocolate come from? Is it from the seeds or the stem or the roots? Well, there is an answer. Okay, so let's take a look. All right, it comes from the seeds. And oh my, those seeds have a lot of pieces to them, I'll tell you, and they're used in many different ways. Okay, so let's take a look at the plant itself. There's the flower over there on the upper right-hand corner, and it's quite beautiful and very elaborate. Take a look at that. Almost looks like a passion flower. So this is really interesting because people have had to do a lot to move this plant around the rest of the world to grow it and have a crop, because when it was in its native home in the New World in northern, we think it evolved in northern South America. The unscented white to pink flowers are actually pollinated by a tiny gnat-like midge, okay? On cacao plantations today, only 3 of 1,000 flowers are pollinated, fertilized, and make fruit. And all of these pollinations today on plantations are done by hand. Why? Because when the cacao tree or the cacao plant evolved in northern South America, that's where the midge was also, and it became its sole pollinator. Well, the midge doesn't live anywhere else but there. So to grow this plant and get it to produce chocolate, you have to not only move the plant, but you also have to move the midges and start breeding them wherever you go. So it's a pretty complicated process and fascinating. So chocolate's in the what we call the cacao family, the Sterculiaceae, and it's just not a very common plant family. There are not that many species in it. And it was given the name when it was discovered by the Europeans, probably Carl Linnaeus named it, and it was named Theobroma cacao, which is Mayan and Aztec for food of the gods. Okay, so this plant was known and being used by the Mayans, and this is like 200, 300 AD. It was thought to be of divine origin, and the Mayans grew chocolate. We know that on the Yucatan Peninsula 2,000 years ago from what the records tell us. This illustration that you see is from a Mayan glyph showing the cacao fruit. If you look at the individual, the person in the middle of the photo of the image, you'll see little cacao fruits popping out, almost as if that person is the trunk of a tree. It's growing straight out from that person. So we think it was lowland tropical American origin. We knew the Mayans grew it 2,000 years ago. And then the Aztecs began to cultivate it as a crop. Montezuma himself, the leader of the Aztecs, when Cortez invaded Mexico, was drinking bitter chocolate. It was a beverage that the Aztecs drank. And then Cortez himself, Hernan Cortez, took the plant back to Europe. And as we know, the rest is history. I know we're running out of time. Bethany, how much time do you think we have?
Karen, you can take as much time as you want. I have the program scheduled to 2:15, and it is 1:56 right now. So
Okay, we've got about maybe 10 more minutes. That's
Okay,
it.
great. That's totally fine. We can definitely go over a little bit if you need to. No worries.
I just don't want to bore everybody.
I think they're pretty fascinated. I know I am. So thank you.
Oh, chocolate. Let me tell you. Someone asked me at the beginning of the year if I'd made any New Year's resolutions, and I said, "Oh yeah, of course I did." And they said, "Well, what were they?" And I didn't want to tell them most of them, but I did say, "Well, I did make a resolution, and it was that this year my New Year's resolution was to eat more chocolate because it's such a great fruit." But as I was saying earlier, when European historians came to the New World after the conquest, they began to record everything. And this illustration, this picture is from another codex, like the Florentine Codex, and it shows the tribute that the Aztecs extracted twice a year. This was the Aztecs just before Cortez invaded. This was part of the culture. Twice a year from the cacao growing region of Soconusco in southern Mexico. And look here, next to the jaguar skins in the image, in the picture, are two baskets of cacao beans, which were used as currency, as well as the drink of the elite. And each of those is topped, look, by 5 flag-like symbols, each of which equals 20, okay? Therefore, 200 loads were required to pay tribute. And this is a 1545 list of commodity prices in Tlaxcala. And it gives an idea of the purchasing value of cacao. And that is, you could get a good turkey hen for 100 cacao beans, a turkey egg for 3, a fully ripe avocado for 1 cacao bean. Now that's a good trade. And a large tomato for 1 cacao bean. So, I mean, I just can't tell you enough about how fascinating this is when you look at how cacao is used as currency. And even today, we don't use it for currency, but we certainly pay a good price for the cocoa and the chocolate that we eat and enjoy so much. So let's take a little look at the cultivation because it is fascinating. It's a shade-grown tropical crop. You can see this young lady, she's harvesting the fruits right off the stems. This looks to me to be somewhere, I think it might be in Malaysia, where cacao is grown extensively today. And here's how it gets processed. First of all, these photos are from Mexico from a traditional cacao processor. The pods ripen after 3 months. And then they pull the seeds out and ferment them in piles for about 3 to 7 days. And the seed pulp ferments and produces acetic acid, believe it or not, and alcohol, which penetrate the seed and activate enzymes that generate the volatile compounds that create chocolate aroma and flavor. Now, how cool is that? I mean, people are pretty smart. They figured that one out. Then they take the seeds themselves, and they roast them and dry the beans, and that brings out the flavor. And you can see this little image up at the top here on the right of roasted and unroasted. And down below here, you see a roasted seed with a brown COT. COT means cotyledon. And the cotyledon are the leaves of the baby plant. So that's roasted. That's the seed of the baby plant in there. And inside those lines, those brown lines that you see in the corner of that little photo, those are the actual, the seed leaves here of it, all roasted and cooked. Then the beans are cracked and ground. And the seed leaves, the part that is so flavorful, the brown part, are called nibs. And those are the seed leaves. That's what chocolate comes from. And chocolate is obtained from these little seed nibs. And then to mass produce chocolate, you take all these little nibs and you put them in a giant processor and you grind them up and you stir them and stir them and stir them until you actually separate the chocolate from the chocolate fat. And there you go. You end up with chocolate. So here's some other facts about chocolate and chocolate manufacture. Theobromine, which is the essential chemical, it's an alkaloid and a mild stimulant. That's what makes us happy when we eat chocolate. And cocoa butter come from the seed husk. So right here from the husk of the seed. Okay, here's the bean, here's the fruit, here's the bean just below it. Chocolate comes from the seed leaves or the cotyledons, or what we call the nibs. The baking chocolate and cocoa powder come from the liquor that comes out of the processing of the seed leaves or the nibs. And milk chocolate is chocolate mixed with sweetened condensed milk, which was invented by the Nestle company in 1875. And one thing to realize is that sugar wasn't, the Aztec people didn't have ready sources, or the Native Americans didn't have ready sources of sugar from sugar cane, because it wasn't brought to the New World until the 1500s. They had honey as a sweetener. And so chocolate used by Native Americans wasn't sweet chocolate, it was the bitter chocolate. But when chocolate was brought over to Europe, not much time passed before people were dumping sugar in and making sweet chocolate. And that was how really, sweetened chocolate came to be. But it's a long evolved process, and chocolate's been with us since then. And I guess that's the end for now. I could go on forever about other stuff, but I'm just not going to do that today. I don't want to bore you. But if you want to learn more about all of this, and this is where I get the information, this is the basic information for my lectures and some really interesting things. It comes from this book called Plants in Our World by Beryl Simpson and Molly Oversaw from University of Texas. And if you need a good basic reference for your library on ethnobotany and the uses of plants, this is the one for you. And I use it all the time, and it's just, in my opinion, one of the best books ever written, especially on economic uses of plants, economic botany. So I encourage you to go online and spend the money. It's not cheap, it's a little under $100, but it is something that you will value. And you can also get used copies online. There are also some resources I wanted to tell you about. I call them Find It Fast resources. And one of them is this wonderful place called the USDA Plants Database, which is a database of all plants that grow in North America. Sadly, we don't have a South American or a Central American or a Mexican plants database, but we do have one for the United States of America. Your tax dollars at work, but it is called the USDA Plants Database, and you can type in the name common or scientific. If you look here in the middle, there's a little search box there, and I typed in corn, that's the common name, and up pops everything we know about corn. And so they have general information on the taxonomy, the scientific name, they have images, how it's classified, subordinate taxa, the legal status, which means is it endangered or not? And of course, corn isn't, but there are many other plants that are. Related links will take you to a lot of really interesting places like that ethnobotany link I showed you. And then it's wildlife use if it has any. So this is a really valuable website, and I hope you all will take a look at it and run through it a couple times and give it a try. Also, there's this online flora of all known plants, and you can go to this website and learn any plant, common name, scientific name, you can look it up here. And this is another valuable resource for anyone who wants to know more about plants. And that's it.